Happy birthday to us. Happy birthday to us. Happy birthday, dear podcast. Happy birthday to us. We are now 5 years old. It's time for us to start school.
Well, not necessarily. You don't have to start school in this country until the age of 6. And as someone who's a trained primary school teacher, I endorse that particular practice.
Okay, well, we still should be thinking about what sort of school to send our podcast to. Something sort of a state school?
Well, obviously, we don't want to raise a libertarian podcast.
Yeah, some more sort of inner city?
Well, we do want the podcast to mingle with a diverse set of other podcasts.
Yes, we want our podcast to have friends.
Just like us.
Well, like we used to.
So alone.
So lonely.
I need a hug.
Me too. Me too. Not from you, obviously. The Podcaster's Guide to the Conspiracy, brought to you today by Josh Edison and Dr. M. Dentith. Hello and welcome to the Podcaster's Guide to the Conspiracy. I am Josh Edison. Sitting next to me, Dr. MRX Dentith. 5 years.
5 glorious years.
Technically, it was 5 years, like 2 weeks ago, when we had the pre-recorded news article episodes going, which was just an unfortunate coincidence.
To quote Douglas Adams, time is an illusion. Podcast time doubly so.
Something like that, yes. Now, I'd like to say it's because of our 5-year anniversary that we're considering a new format for the podcast, but it was kind of coincidence. It's absolute lie. Just happened to think of it at the same time. Nevertheless, we are thinking of a slight mix-up to the formatting here.
We are going to change the way the news works. It's a new news paradigm for a new
Podcast
of
format
the year. So yeah, the idea is we are only going to be doing news updates now once a month. So you're going to get 3 weeks of content and then a laid-back discussion of the news. We're going to mix things up a bit.
Yes. So if you don't like the news bits and always skip through them to get to the main body of the episode, then you'll like 3 episodes out of 4 a month and you can just skip the news one. And if you really like the news ones, then maybe you can skip the other 3 and just get your news fix once a month.
Although,
straight
of course,
into your veins.
Patrons are going to find out about the news more frequently because we will still be talking about news
Recent
items
events.
and recent events to our patrons every week.
Every week.
So they either suffer or get the glory of news on a weekly basis. Lucky/poor them.
Yes. So with that in mind, of course, the one of the implications of that is that episodes are probably going to be a bit shorter, which I think is a good thing.
Yeah, I think so.
It seems to be the way of podcasts. Lengths just creep up and up and up. So
I mean, we've tried for years to try to get this to be a half-hour podcast, and it's never worked.
It worked for a while. I think our very first episodes came in at under half an hour.
And then about in year 3, we managed to do a bit of half-hour episoding for a while. And in part, it's because we have absolutely no timing devices. We are modern people with a lot of technological support, and yet we've never actually set up a kind of timer to work out how long the podcast is running. It would be really, really easy to do, but we're very lazy. Just very, very lazy.
Yeah. Nevertheless, so that means that today's topic, which is a fine and interesting topic, I think you'll agree, is all that we're going to be talking about this week. So maybe we should get into that right now.
Indeed, let's not go to the news.
So this episode, we take you through time back to the year 1980, checks notes 6.
And to the exotic locale of Stockholm, Sweden.
Yes, because this week we're going to be talking about the murder of the Swedish president Olof Palme, who I hadn't actually heard of this before.
So I know the story from the Fortean Times. So there's a scholar who writes for the Fortean Time, Jan Bodenstam, although it may be Bonston, and he's written quite a lot on the assassination or murder, depending on how you want to pass this, of Olof Palme. And so I've kind of always been aware of the kind of conspiracy theories that circle around the death of a Swedish Prime Minister, an unsolved case, possibly the biggest police investigation in all human history.
Quite possibly.
In that the Swedes actually changed their law to remove the statute of limitations around this particular case so they can continue investigating it to this present day. As of 2016, they had produced 700,000 pages of investigative notes, and the cost of the investigation currently is about 350 Swedish krona, which is something like 61 million US dollars or something of that
something
particular
like
stripe.
that, yeah.
It's a vast
money.
investigation. It's been going on for a while, and they still don't know who killed their Prime Minister.
Now, yeah, I mean, my wife asked me, so what are you going to be talking about this week? And I said, the murder, the Swedish Prime Minister was assassinated in 1984, apparently. And she's like, oh, right, they never found the guy, did they? So she's less ignorant than I am. It does seem strange they hadn't heard of this, because it is the assassination of a head of state. It's the European JFK, basically.
Yeah, basically.
Olof Palme was a very popular if you were on the left, and very unpopular if you're on the right Prime Minister. He was, very inspired strong feelings either way. So, I mean, the facts of it are that he was walking home from the movies late at night in February of 1986 on the streets of Stockholm, Sweden. Somebody walked up behind him, shot him at point-blank range, fired a shot at his wife, Lisbeth Palme, but missed her, I believe, and then ran, and was never seen again. And over the years there have been numerous theories about who it was and why and how and what have you, which we'll be getting into.
And numerous investigations as well.
Numerous investigations, and yet, as of today, nobody actually knows who did it.
They do not.
No. Probably should have waited until you'd finished your mouthful of...
No, or you should have shocked me, so I spat
Actually,
the
I should have said something a bit more
And
surprising.
I know who killed him. Bum, bum, bum.
But yes, so unlike the JFK case, where they came up with a culprit fairly quickly, whether or not you agree with the official theory, and life moved on, this is sort of an obsession to this very day. And while there have been numerous police investigations, of course, there have also been numerous amateur, civilian, I suppose you'd say, investigations, which have led to a number of theories.
And also political scandals. But we'll get into that in just a minute. Let's talk about the person who was initially arrested for the murder.
This would be Victor Gunnarsson.
That's the one.
Yes, Victor Gunnarsson. Yep. There are so many. So yeah, straight away, actually, was it was him, and then it was the PPK investigation, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. So Victor Gunnarsson, he was arrested for the murder, basically because of who he had ties to. I'm not aware of there being any...
Well, he was basically a usual suspect. He was an extreme right-winger with professed antipathy towards Olof Palme. When they arrested him, they found a lot of pamphlets against the Swedish, the Social Democrats and Palme in his flat. And so he was basically the most likely suspect because he was the most notable hater of the Prime Minister at the time.
Yes, now because we should, as I said, Olof Palme, very sort of polarising figure. He had led the Swedish Social Democratic Party from 1969 until he died in 86. He'd been Prime Minister from 69 to 72, and then when the Social Democratic Party got back in 82, he was the Prime Minister from then until his death. He was very outspoken on all the issues of the day, from a very left-wing perspective. So
and also a bit of a TV celebrity as well.
He was kind of Sweden's first political celebrity. He was their Jacinda, I guess. He was their JFK, really, right down to the assassination. So because of his fairly outspoken stances, he was anti-Vietnam War, very strongly anti-apartheid. We'll see more of that later. So all the polarising issues of the day, he was very firmly on the left side of them, which meant people on the right, lots of people on the right, really, really didn't like him. So
they did not.
So it's not surprising that you could find one person with very strong anti-Palme views. I'm sure you probably could have found quite a few. They picked up Victor Gunnarsson for being one of the usual suspects, but nothing became of that because there was basically no evidence at all.
Yes, I mean, it was all circumstantial. You don't like the Prime Minister, do you? No, I do not. The Prime Minister is dead. Good. Well, ipso facto, you must have killed him. And the prosecutors went, there isn't actually enough of a case here. Just because someone hates the Prime Minister doesn't necessarily mean they go around shooting them.
No.
I mean, sometimes.
Sometimes
it
it
happens,
does, yeah.
But sometimes it also doesn't.
So the first big investigation was done by a man called Hans Holmer, who was chief of the Swedish National Security Service.
Or SAPO.
Or SAPO, yes, with umlauts over the A. So he went straight for the Kurdistan Workers' Party, otherwise known as the PPK. And again, this was kind of a case of a usual suspect sort of thing. As far as I could tell, there was no evidence against them initially. And yet he was convinced they were the ones responsible and spent over a year looking for evidence that they were responsible and never really found any. There were raids, there were arrests and so on, but nothing ever turned up any evidence linking PPK to the assassination.
And it seemed that it really was a case that Holmer, who was a member of the party, so he was a social democrat, was convinced that the murder had to have been committed by a foreign power rather than it being a case of a domestic act of terror. So he refused to even look into the possibility that it was someone who was Swedish who had committed the murder. He immediately went for Kurdistanis as kind of the other in Stockholm at the time. So he was very politically motivated to avoid any investigation into a Swedish connection because he was convinced it had to come from outside the system.
And so after a year, after more than a year and nothing happening, he basically, he was kind of in disgrace at this point. The papers and everything were against him.
Well, I mean, he caused issues. So he claimed that Palme had been shot with a Smith & Wesson .357 for no particularly good reason, but because he kept on insisting this was the murder weapon that was used, and even brandished a replica of the gun at a press conference, this focused police attention on this particular weapon, which then meant that other investigations actually weren't undertaken.
So after he was booted off, then there were investigations of his investigation, multiple investigations of his investigation. He would then go on to be involved in other scandals.
And one which relates to the investigation of Olof Palme.
He sort of privately on his own steam continued investigating the PPK angle, and ended up getting done. What was he doing? He was importing listening devices or placing them. He was
one of the two.
One of the two.
But yeah, he got involved in what's called the Ebbe Carlsson affair, which was a major scandal in Sweden in the late 80s, where it turned out that Ebbe Carlsson, a journalist, publisher, and former secretary of the Swedish government, was carrying out an independent and illegal investigation into the assassination of Palme, which was secretly supported by the then Minister for Justice, Anna Greta Leijon.
Yeah, so the whole thing was embarrassing just for the government all round. It sort of showed up a real old boys network kind of thing, and he was there in the middle of it. So Ebbe Carlsson had also concluded that Olof Palme had been assassinated by the PKK. He thought that the Secret Service, the SAPO, could have prevented the murder by tapping their phones, and what did he write? Checking the notes. He argued that PKK had been ordered to assassinate Palme by the Iranian government at a meeting at Damascus, so then the Iranians come into it as well. But again, just more trying to make the evidence fit a theory.
I mean, at least with the Ebbe Carlsson affair, we kind of had a rationale as to why the assassination may have occurred, if you take it the murder was a politically motivated assassination. Because the claim was that in 1985, Palme had stopped the Iranians from acquiring a Swedish air defense missile system. And thus the Iranians were annoyed, so they then employed Kurdistanis to then enact revenge upon the Swedes by killing off their prime minister.
And so, Holmer got in trouble for basically breaking the law by trying to set up his own wiretaps and so on. During an investigation that was completely unofficial and off the books.
It was off the books, but being supported by the government in a way which was then embarrassing when it came out.
For all concerned. So that was that. Next suspect was a man called Christer Pettersson.
And he was convicted of the murder after being identified by Lisbeth Palme.
Yep, so in 1989, so 3 years later now, this man was convicted of the murder of Olof Palme, but then his conviction was overturned on appeal. He had the prosecution didn't really come up with a motive. They didn't have the murder weapon at all, this .357 or whatever it supposedly was, and the whole reliability of him being picked out of a lineup was brought into question. And I think these days lineups, while they're still used, I believe, are considered to be basically unreliable and a waste of everyone's time.
And also we do lineups in a very different way from when we did them in the 80s, because in the 80s you took 5 people, say, who looked completely unlike each other, and then paraded the eyewitness in front of them and kind of gave them nudges to identify the right person. Well, so now the science of lineups is make everyone look as identical as possible, make sure the eyewitness can't be seen by the suspects, and also randomize it. So in some situations you might do several lineups in a row, and only one of them will have the suspect in order to make sure that the person is really, really sure the person they're pointing at is the person they thought they saw.
So Pettersson went on to be, he was a bit of an interesting character. I mean, again, he was kind of a usual suspect as well. He was a known criminal, he was an alcoholic, he was just a general bad sort. And who sort of fitted nicely for the so if it was going to be a local and not some foreign influence, at least it was a disreputable local.
Yes,
it was a criminal, not
a decent Swede.
Yes. But no, so his conviction was overturned.
He was awarded $50,000 in compensation. I don't know whether that's 50,000 US or 50,000 Swedish krona. I'm assuming it must be 50,000 US.
So he sort of then capitalised on his fame / notoriety
by claiming to have killed Olof Palme.
Yeah, he did make claims that he had done it, but it was usually thought that he was just sort of trying to get attention, get a bit of money from TV interviews, that sort of thing.
I mean, to the point where the police went back to the court and said, we want to prosecute this person again, and the Supreme Court went, yeah, the new evidence isn't particularly compelling. It looks like he's just saying things to get attention.
So he died in 2004.
But just before or on his deathbed, he contacted the son of Olof Palme, Martin, and claimed he had a big story to tell. And Martin's response was, look, I'm only willing to talk to you if you admit to killing my father. And the meeting did not occur before Pettersson's death.
There was a documentary a couple of years later where some of his associates claimed that he had confessed to them that he had killed the Prime Minister, although it was a case of mistaken identity. He mistook him for a drug dealer who happened to be wearing similar clothing.
And walked that particular path
and walked that
night.
route, yeah. And so the whole thing was just a mistake. And so that, I believe, was the last sort of court case. But since then, as we say, there have been numerous investigations, both official and unofficial, and numerous theories. Now, I mean, it's one of those cases kind of like the JFK murder where if anyone you can name has been blamed for the murder, basically, you'll be able to find a conspiracy theorist who thinks it was lizard people and Masons and UFOs and so on.
All at the same time.
All at the same time. But some of the more concrete, I suppose, theories are still nevertheless very, very wide-ranging. South Africa comes up a bit.
Well, it was an exciting time in South Africa, what with apartheid and all.
Yes, as we said before, Palme himself was very vocal, very anti-apartheid. Now, South Africa apparently had this Operation Long Reach, which was supposedly a top secret program to sort of neutralise opposition to apartheid around the world, and the claim was that Palme's assassination was part of this operation, that he was done in by either by South African agents directly or by people set up by South African agents.
People funded by Operation Long Reach. And this was the favoured theory of one Stieg Larsson.
Yeah, so the author of The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo and that series of books was planning on writing a book about the Palme assassination.
His career was an investigative journalist before he became a novelist.
Unfortunately, he died before he could finish that book, but his theory that he was working on was that it was an assassination, which was a collaboration between Operation Long Reach and local right-wing extremists in Sweden. So that's one. Again, I don't know what evidence they're basing it on other than allegations from in 1996. Apparently there was one guy who was a commander of a South African police hit squad who claimed that they were responsible, but that's the only evidence I've read about for being just the word of one person.
And of course this is one of the odd things you get with events of this particular type, which is that, and you actually see this a lot with JFK, people often on their deathbed making a shocking revelation they were involved in the assassination of JFK. And of course the problem is, given the number of shocking revelations about who was involved in the assassination of JFK, either you've got a really over-determined assassination of JFK, where lots and lots of very disparate groups acting independently all got together on one day and accidentally murdered him multiple times, or you have people on their deathbed going, I've got a theory about something, I'm going to throw a stone in the lake and see what happens. I know when I die, on my deathbed, I'm going to admit to a lot of things I never did.
I think you should.
You should kill me now so I can make my deathbed about deathbed assassination. My deathbed assassination is, as you kill me, I'll kill you at the same time.
Clever.
I know, it's very clever.
Still,
revelation, deathbed revelation.
We've got the rest of the episode to record though, so maybe save it till later. Maybe that can be the bonus content, just our dying gurgles as we slowly murder each other.
Josh, I do want to point out, you're dying right now.
Well, yes, we all are.
I mean, you're literally dying right now.
Yeah, we all are. We are literally dying 1 second at a time. Sorry for the bleak nihilist existentialism there, but that's the truth.
Fine.
I actually, in looking around, I saw one YouTube video about the South African theory by an author who claimed that having published this book, he was visited had a stranger knock on his door at one point and asked to use the bathroom, and then later that day this author suddenly fell violently ill and went to hospital and claimed to have been poisoned, which he reckoned was because he was telling the truth about the South African theory. But the South African theory is not the only theory.
No, it's not. There's also the theory that he was murdered over a dodgy arms deal between the Swedish arms firm Bofors and the country of India.
So the story there goes that he had initially backed the deal but wasn't aware that Bofors had been involved in a bit of dodgy dealing behind the scenes. They'd been paying bribes to someone or other to make the deal happen. And supposedly just that morning he'd been talking with some ambassador or other who revealed to him the dodginess of the deal, and so therefore had motive to now kill this deal which he had previously backed. So again, this is like, that's a motive, I suppose, to have him assassinated, but I don't know if the theory goes any further than that.
No, as far as I'm aware, the deal never went through, which meant that even if it was the reason for the murder/assassination, it wasn't particularly effective.
No.
Although that being said, conspiracies don't have to be effective to occur.
That's true. So another theory, he was killed by a Chilean fascist by the name of Roberto Tiem, and this fellow didn't like the fact that Palme gave asylum to leftist Chileans following the coup in 1973. So again, a position that Palme had taken a strong stand on, which made him enemies. But again, motive, not much more than that as far as I can tell.
Some people claim the Yugoslavian Secret Service killed him for reasons.
Yep. And then the CIA and Propaganda Due, P2.
Ah, yes, P2.
We've talked about them before. When did we talk about them? Was it Papal Murders?
Yeah.
Was it? Yeah. So they're supposedly involved in papal deaths. Apparently they've been linked to the death of the Swedish Prime Minister.
Yes, and the rationale behind this is, this gets a little complicated quite quickly. So apparently P2's leader, Lucio Galli, sent a telegram to one Philip Garano, Philip Garano is a former Catholic priest, turned restaurateur in New York, turned Republican. So Lucio sent a telegram to Philip saying the Swedish tree will be felled, and then Palme died. Coincidence?
Maybe.
Quite possibly.
I don't know. It's, another spooky wooky thing, but because it's Freemasons and
P2.
Wacky P2 stuff, people lapped that up. Now, another interesting one. The claim that he was murdered by right-wing extremist police officers in Sweden themselves. And this sort of gets to the cock-up versus conspiracy thing, because we didn't say initially, but not only was Hans Holmer's investigation perhaps not up to snuff, in the immediate hours following the murder, the police, the very initial steps were not done particularly competently as well.
No, they didn't do a particularly good job of containing the crime scene.
I think they made it too small, for one thing.
Yeah, which meant that salient evidence was found by the public after the fact, including a bullet casing that was found several days later, which they went, oh, that's probably one of the casings from the bullets that shot the Prime Minister. If only we'd made our circle larger.
So there was some suggestion that, well, maybe the police investigation wasn't incompetent,
but was deliberately designed to make sure the truth wouldn't come out.
Yeah, so that was, again, fairly sort of circumstantial. I don't believe they come up with this theory comes up with any evidence beyond the fact that, the right-wing elements of the police didn't like him because right-wingers didn't like him, and the investigation wasn't conducted well, and then just sort of waggling their eyebrows and saying, join the dots, people.
And I mean, there is a particular thing which is always interesting with events of this particular type. So it's actually fairly uncommon for leaders of sovereign states to be murdered.
Yes. When it happens, doesn't happen often.
No. So you have this kind of weird situation where when an event of this particular kind occurs, people panic because it's a major event and people don't really want to carry the can for any disaster, which means that often things go badly as a kind of matter of fact because people are going, no, I do not want to be held responsible for this going wrong, so you deal with it, I'll step to one side, which means you end up getting investigations which initially actually might look worse than a standard murder investigation because people are absolutely petrified of making things go afoul.
And I believe in 2013 there was a series called Death of a Pilgrim, which I assume was your Scandinois thriller, one of those.
I've seen it.
Have you?
So I was in Norway and it was New Year's and we were looking for things to watch on Norwegian Netflix which had English subtitles because Norway, they speak Norwegian there. And it's amazing how many local Scandi dramas have no English subtitles on Norwegian Netflix. So we're flicking through trying to find something which I can watch in a family of people who otherwise speak Norwegian. And so we find the series called Death of a Pilgrim, which is a 2013 conspiracy thriller set in Stockholm where a cold case squad reinvestigate the murder of Olof Palme and, shockingly enough, solve the crime. Now, whilst we were watching it, one of the people was going, but they never did solve that. How are they? Okay, so no, this is a fictional solving of a case of a major event in Swedish history in which people are descendants of Olof and Lisbeth Palme who are still alive, and they're going, oh no, it was quite definitely corrupt police officers in the Swedish police force.
Yes, so in that fictional reenactment. They solved the case. It hasn't happened yet, though.
Yeah, it was really weird to watch because you're getting to the final episode going, they can't solve the case. I mean, it's an unsolved murder. You can't suddenly fictionalize. No, they're doing it. They've solved the crime.
Did an Inglourious Bastards.
Yeah,
Just
basically.
sort of spun off a new history timeline. And so then we come to the last theory in our list, which is quite an interesting one. This is the claim that he was murdered by a man called Stig Engström. Now, Mr. Engström, there's umlauts over the O, he was one of the initial eyewitnesses to the murder. He claims he saw it happen and was first on the scene, tried to resuscitate Prime Minister Palme and gave statements to the police. But some people think rather than he was very much the first on the scene because he was the actual murderer.
And then he was there before it was a crime scene.
Now again, he committed suicide in 2000, so he's not around to be questioned anymore. But the case against him is basically some people who saw the killer running away. I believe where it was, there was like a raised street level or something, so the killer fired off 2 shots and then immediately shot up, not shots, perhaps the wrong word, ran up a set of stairs to an elevated thing and sort of disappeared from sight of anyone who was down on the low level where the street was. The people who saw the fleeing killer reckon that the killer looked a bit like Engström.
But also noted that they didn't see Engström at the scene when he claimed to be there. As in, when the police turned up, they're going, Engström, who claims to have been at the scene informing police officers about things, we don't remember seeing him there, as if maybe he had fled the scene before the police arrived.
So something seems a little... there were claims that his testimony was a little bit dodgy. He apparently owned a gun. He worked just a short distance away from where the Palmers had been walking. That's why he was there at the time. And he was apparently very, very right-wing and hated Prime Minister Palme. I think
he also lied about his movements that particular night, which is probably not a wise thing to do during a police investigation of a Swedish Prime Minister.
I think what makes this case interesting is that it takes the whole idea away of it being some sort of planned assassination to it being a crime of opportunity. He hated this guy, suddenly happened to see an opportunity to kill him and hopefully get away with it and just jumped at the chance. One thing which some people have made much of is the fact that Palme and his wife were walking home from going to the movies. That was their movements that evening. They'd gone to a film, they were walking home when the shooting happened. Apparently they'd only decided to go to the movie at the very last minute. He, from the sounds of things, he sort of got home from work or whatever, and his family was having a conversation about, hey, should we go out to the movies tonight? And then, decided, oh yeah, why not? Let's go do that. So it's not like there was any way people could have really known in advance, unless they were sort of tailing him and staking him out and he was under some sort of heavy surveillance. People couldn't have known that was where he was going to be that night, so which seemed to sort of lend a little bit of credence towards it being a crime of opportunity.
Yes, I mean, so if it was a premeditated crime, it was a premeditated crime of him being surveilled and looking for an opportunity, as opposed to in this case, which would be going, well, actually he was in the wrong place at the wrong time and the person who hated him was there with a gun.
So I mean, it does seem a fear that you'd have to really hate someone to run out and kill them just because you happen to see the chance.
Unless, of course, he saw them going to the theatre and went, well, you're going to be there for 2.5 hours, so I can just go get my gun.
But even then, killing a Prime Minister, that's not a small thing. For someone to hate the guy that much that he'll would run out into the street and shoot him and then assume he could just run off and not...
Josh, someone today set themselves on fire on the White House lawn. People do strange
things. Yeah,
now, it should be pointed out, this was investigated at the time by the police, and they didn't see any merit to this particular claim that he was the assassin.
No, but it's an interesting theory nonetheless, and interesting to see that among all these theories, you have ideas that maybe and in the Peterson case, maybe it was an accident. He was mistaken for someone else. Maybe it was a crime of opportunity. On the other hand, maybe it was, organised assassination carried out by members of a foreign state. There's a whole range of conspiracies there. I guess the only question that remains is, why are we talking about this thing now when it happened 30 years ago?
New evidence, Joshua. New evidence. And this
evidence.
once again speaks to how badly the crime scene was contained at the time, because now it turns out a walkie-talkie was found in the vicinity of Palmer's murdered body by a member of the public. And this has only come to light now, and the natural response is walkie-talkie? I mean, that would indicate that if the walkie-talkie belonged to the murderer, then they were probably getting instructions from someone, which really does suggest an organised hit and a conspiracy.
Yeah, but it just seems such a strange thing. How could it be 30 years later, this bit of evidence turns up? What had it been doing in the meantime? And 30 years on, how could you even tell with any sort of reliability at all that it was actually found? You'd be able to, okay, obviously it's a 30-year-old walkie-talkie from the make and the model and the what have you, but I don't see how it could... how you could get anything reliable from it. They said they're going to be testing it for DNA to see if there's any trace of whoever might have been using it still on it, but then surely there could also be traces of whoever's handled it
in the last 30 years.
So I don't know. So I mean, it seems like, it's a case that has been a almost national obsession, I suppose, in Sweden. People really, really, really want to have it solved, but every year that goes by, it seems less likely that that's ever going to happen. What with, subjects dying on account of the passage of time.
I mean, eventually Sweden will be wiped off the map just by geology. But even then, the investigation will still be open.
So, yeah, I mean, it's like, it reminds me of like the Madeleine McCann disappearance, where we keep having headlines here in New Zealand, even, new evidence in the McCann case. And it's like, well, it's a tragedy, sure, but why, after all this time, are we obsessed? I mean, I suppose in the Madeleine McCann one, it's just, it sounds callous to say, just one little girl, whereas the Palme case, it's the Prime Minister of a country. That is a bigger deal.
I mean,
there is still the idea of...
I mean, because we've got this weird thing going on in this country at the moment, which is the re-entry into the Pike River mine,
yes.
Which was a mining disaster which is a decade ago now, actually.
Something like
quite
that.
some time ago. It was a major mine fire leading to loss of life and the mine being basically entombed. And the spouses and parents of the miners who died in that tragedy have been spending a lot of time and effort asking the government of the day to reopen the mine so they can go into the mine and either find out what happened or bring the bodies out. And it is one of those things where if you're not personally attached to the miners, you end up going, why are we spending so much time and effort on this particular issue? And yet, for some people, it's important.
Yeah, and the fact that it's almost sort of an election issue. I mean, that was one of the things...
the current government and New Zealand First, which is actually part of the government, so
coalition.
So Labour and New Zealand First campaigned on they would reopen the mine because the previous government, the national government, was going, no, it's a health and safety risk, we can't do it.
So yes, but anyway, it is that sort of thing. But we're not here to talk about Pike River. We're here to talk about the murder of Olof Palme, and yet I think we've about finished talking about the murder.
We have, I think, finished talking about the murder or assassination.
Or assassination.
And actually, that's the big thing here. So, if it's a murder, then it may not be conspiratorial, though maybe there's a cover-up involved here to try and prevent people from finding out who actually committed the crime, especially if it turned out to be a police officer. If it's an assassination, then it's a conspiracy for the sheer fact that it's an organised hit. And then there's the question as to whether the investigations quite deliberately went off to try and stop people from finding out about these things. So one thing we kind of didn't mention is that one of the criticism of the Hans Holmer investigation into the death of Olof Palme is the notion that by focusing so squarely on PKK and not looking at a domestic link, maybe that was designed to take the investigation in a particular direction to protect people in the party from being investigated either for the murder or being investigated for other things surrounding the murder at the time. Because, of course, it might not be a cover-up of who did it, but it might be a cover-up of other scandals that might emerge if a proper investigation was ever engaged in.
So there you have it, an interesting case. I'm glad I found out about it, actually. It was quite interesting to read up on. And I think that brings us to the end of our new format, slightly more truncated episode.
But for patrons, there's more to come because we have an update on the person who assaulted James Shaw, although it's a very, very short update. Actually, I could give the update now, but I'm going to let you hold on. We're going to be talking about whether space aliens are interbreeding with humans.
Fingers crossed.
And why. We'll probably talk a little bit about the Treasury leak that occurred just a few days ago in our own fair country. And then a little return to a discussion of someone we've talked about in the past, Naomi Wolf.
That's a deep cut.
It is a very deep. I mean, it's going back to the first year. And her issue with the notion of death recorded in British law.
So if you're one of our patrons, A, thank you. B, stick around for that. If you're not one of our patrons, thank you for listening anyway. And we'll see you next week for another shorter episode with no news.
But still packed with jam.
Oh, yes.
You've been listening to the Podcaster's Guide to the Conspiracy, starring Josh Addison and Dr. MRX Dentith, which is written, researched, recorded and produced by Josh and M. You can support the podcast by becoming a patron via its Podbean or Patreon campaigns. And if you need to get in contact with either Josh or M, you can email them at podcastconspiracy@gmail.com or check their Twitter accounts, monkeyfluids and Conspiracism. And remember, it's just a step to the left.